Welcome back, everybody, to Bulletproof Selling. My name is Sean Rhodes, the Chief Sales Sergeant here at Bulletproof Selling and author of the book of Bulletproof Selling, a guide for systemizing sales for the battlefield of business. Here at Bulletproof Selling, we believe that hope is not a sales strategy. So we're here as often as we can to bring the lessons of the battlefield into the business, into the boardroom that you're in, so that you can increase the performance of your salespeople, your pipeline velocity, and of course, the results of your sales team. Now, in this Bulletproof Selling series, I'm really blessed because I get to interview some of the top minds in sales, Hall of Fame speakers, best-selling authors, trainers, folks that are out there managing sales teams, and even folks that are delving into the neuroscience of what it takes to sell, to convince someone to turn over their hard-earned dollars and time to buy what it is that you have to offer, whether that's a product or a service. And of course, out of every single one of these episodes, my commitment to you is that I'm going to build a sales system with my guests that you can use no matter the size of your goals or the size of your team. Now, I mentioned a little bit about neuroscience today, and if you're a regular follower of us here, you may think to yourself, Sean, I hear a lot about bringing lessons from the battlefield in, a lot about how the military's highest performers are planning, executing, preparing, debriefing their missions, and how we can use that as salespeople. But what does neuroscience have to do with it? Well, more than you might think. Believe it or not, there are whole departments of the US military for sure, and I guarantee in other countries that have neuroscientists working on staff because they are focused on the performance of those folks. Now, they understand that mission success is at stake. They understand bringing folks home is at stake. So they're willing to invest in what do we need to know about how the human brain works, about how we can communicate with one another, and how we can maximize our performance in order to get the job done. And that's why it is a rare treat when I meet someone in the field of sales that has that neuroscience background and can help us link something that usually requires decades of work and multiple PhDs with what we can do today to become better salespeople. And that's why it's my pleasure to welcome to the show today, Mr. Moeed Amin. Welcome to Bulletproof Selling, sir.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on. I'm a fan of your show and love the introduction as well. I remember listening to one of your episodes. In the introduction, I thought, man, if this guy doesn't have a military background, I'd be really disappointed. And it turns out you did, so that was cool. So,
Turns out I did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I was blessed to run around the world with the highest performing folks in the Marine Corps, Army, Navy, Air Force, and had a great time doing it, studying what they were bringing to their missions, and then my work for the last couple of decades has been applying that into the field of sales. So when I hear somebody that's a neuroscientist, I think to myself, academic, probably, researcher, most definitely, but sales. That's not something you hear very often. So walk us through how you went from neuroscience into sales, or if sales came first and that got you into neuroscience. Tell us a little bit about you, man.
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, I'm the only person that has both backgrounds, right? Because usually you have someone that is a neuroscientist, PhD, that's trying to teach sales folks about the kind of how the brain works and how that affects decision making, or it's the other way around, where you have a salesperson that just became interested in neuroscience and tried to use that to advance further. Whereas I seem to come from both. Started off with neuroscience, actually. So I majored in neuroscience at university or college in America.
Mhm.
Didn't know what I was going to do with it. Fumbled around, fell into sales. And, honestly, it wasn't going well for the first year or two in sales. I helped close, I think it was £1 million £1 million deal with my first real employer, but it wasn't going well. So I had to leave before they were going to fire me. And then another company, which I ended up learning a lot from, they heard about me in that deal and they headhunted me. Even though I left, they headhunted me, brought me on. And then about a year later, the 2008 financial crash hit. And that was a tough time. So it really wasn't going well for me. And, I was kind of thinking about, my choices in life. One Saturday, I decided to clean out my bookshelf, or just rearrange my bookshelf. And one of my neuroscience textbooks fell on my head. Like, it literally fell on my head. And I looked down at it.
On your skull.
Yeah, right. And if that wasn't a message, then
Yeah.
I can't think what else could be. But I looked down at this book and I thought, I've been going about this all the wrong way, because I was being taught sales techniques, skills, approaches that A, it wasn't resonating with me. I didn't feel comfortable doing a lot of it. And B, it wasn't really working for the buyer. And I looked down at this book, and it was one of my textbooks on cognitive neuroscience. It was all around the kind of behavioral side of things, the thought patterns, the decision making, etc. And I thought, well, I haven't heard anyone talk about this. So,
Hmm.
I looked at that and I thought, well, let me dive back into it and see if there's something to be learned there. So I kind of just dove into it for a long time. I'm not a PhD in it for sure,
Okay.
but I dove into it for a long time, and I started applying it, but it was very uncomfortable applying it for the first month or two, because it was completely against conventional wisdom in sales. But after that, the results were just incredible.
Give me some
And
examples of how it's unconventional, so that our listeners understand. You were almost trying to speak another language. I'm sure it felt like another language. Walk us through some examples of what neuroscience will tell you to do that most salespeople will tell you not to do.
yeah, so the first thing was emotion. Emotion
Mm,
is everything. When you when you look at how we as humans, and when our brain focuses on a goal,
mm,
it starts and ends with emotion. Like, it goes through 4 stages in the brain. It starts with the amygdala, right?
hmm
One of the emotional parts of the brain. It ends with the orbitofrontal cortex, which
mm,
is the part of the brain that basically helps you evaluate how am I going to feel before I start going towards this goal, and when I reach that goal. Like, it actually measures how am I going to feel in terms of that difference.
hmm,
So one of the things that I did was the emotion, because back then we were trained to look at benefits, return of investment. Again, return of investment is very two-dimensional. Value statements, business value, why it's going to actually help this buyer in their world in business. But
hmm
what we're not taught to appreciate is that, firstly, it's a human being that you're speaking with. Secondly, no buyer in this world wakes up one day and goes, boy, I'm really excited to buy this software. No.
Yeah.
No one wakes up like that. What they're excited about is the outcome or the results they're going to get.
Right.
And what
That
they're
end
more
state.
excited about, exactly. And you know what, Sean, what they're more excited about is, what is this going to mean to what I value?
Mm,
My human needs. And there are 6 of them, right? And that's where we make decisions. We don't make decisions based on this. I'm not saying that there's not the logical side. There absolutely is. And the more complex the deal, you can argue, the more logic is involved. But actually, when you look at this, it's not really the case. There are personalities involved. I was speaking to someone earlier. One of the surprising results from my interviews with buyers was that how prevalent trust was, not in terms of trust that the solution is going to be the right one or it's not going to break. No, I'm trusting my reputation with this salesperson in that business. That's a very
hmm
personal thing for me. So emotion was a very big part of that we're not taught. The other part is, and we're starting to get to grips to this, but we're still not getting there, which is making it as simple as possible for the buyer.
mm,
The brain and your nervous system is wired that, when you think about the brain being probably about 7% in proportion to the size of the body, yet it uses almost 30% of the energy consumption of the body. That's a massive amount, and it's very energy intensive. And back then, 10,000 odd years ago, that energy was very valuable. It was very
right.
hard to attain, right? When you think about calories,
Yep.
etc. Um, so that's why habits are formed. Habits are formed because it was a more energy efficient way of conducting a frequent activity. Your brain's basically saying, hey, we're doing this enough. Let's find a better way of doing it, a more energy efficient way of doing so. And when you make a decision, the concept of cognitive load or memory load is, at any one point, the amount of information you hold in order to do something with it, whether it's a decision or come to a judgment, whatever it might be. We were used to just throwing a lot of information at the buyer, creating presentations that had a lot of words, a lot of information, a lot of things that they had to understand. And the brain is not really designed to do that very well, at least for long periods of time. And when I say long periods of time, I mean seconds, not
Right.
minutes or
Yeah. Yeah.
hours.
That's why death
Right?
by PowerPoint is a phrase. Yeah.
It's a massive thing. And, there's a whole area around the neuroscience of presentation, which became very important during the COVID pandemic, because presentations became front and center, not your
hmm
charisma or presence in a meeting anymore. Um, So those were just a couple of examples there, but there were a ton of others that were really against the conventional norm, and it was quite scary to do it at the beginning. But yeah, the results really spoke for themselves.
And so you ended up taking that information, and instead of just working for somebody else, now you run your own company, right? You're actually going out there helping entrepreneurs, helping business people, helping salespeople use neuroscience to connect in a faster, smarter, better way with their clients. Tell us a little bit about that business model and how that works for you. Because I imagine to go into a sales company, which I get to do all the time, where I'm going into a large team or a small team, and say,
Yeah.
you're trying to reach these better results in sales. Let's learn what those are and figure out how can we build a bridge to get your folks there faster. I go about that using the military's way of doing it. You're going about it using science. That's a little different, man. So walk me through a little bit about what you do for organizations and helping take this background and this love of neuroscience and helping them get better sales results.
I mean, look, firstly, to start off, there isn't that much different. I mean, not that much. There isn't as much difference between science and the military as you would think, right? Because the military are a massive proponent of, cutting edge science, or at least cutting edge approaches that really work. And science is
Sure.
rooted in that. So
Oh
actually,
yeah,
there isn't
everything.
that much of a difference, right?
Hmm.
And as you said in the introduction, there are a lot of neuroscientists that work with the military, and that's important. I started the business because I was really fed up of the approaches that salespeople in general
Hmm.
have. Really fed up with some of the training programs, some of, right? Not all, of course. Really fed up with some of the training programs that was, given to salespeople. Really fed up with the expectations that some of these business leaders have of salespeople. I was also really fed up of the misconception that those business leaders have of what good sales look like.
Hmm.
Um, so I use neuroscience not just as front and center, but it's the practical and grounded framework for any kind of taught skill around sales. So if someone is to say, you know, when we talk about, for example, leading with insights, or how you start off a conversation, or how
Hmm.
you craft an outbound email, or even how you craft your 30-second pitch, in order for that to resonate with someone, you've got to understand how someone ingests information, assimilates it, and kind of holds it in,
Hmm.
and then uses that information to make a decision.
Hmm.
And if you don't understand those things, then you're not speaking in a way that actually their mind and body are designed to absorb information. And so when we talk about any of those things, whatever aspects of the sales process, and some extent the marketing process, what we do is we check first with neuroscience and behavioral psychology to say, does this work with our biology? Or does this
Hmm.
run contrary to our biology? And if it runs contrary to our biology, then why are we doing it? Surely there is a way that's more aligned and makes it easier for someone to ingest that information. So I'll give you an example. Leading with insights and the Challenger. Have you read the Challenger book, by the way?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I was a sales leader at the company that created it. In fact, Matt
Hmm.
Dixon, one of the co-authors, is a mentor of mine. Um, they didn't. I don't think they covered the neuroscience. I don't think that was part. But their research was so sound that they uncovered it. When you lead with insights, one of the framework I use is cues, CUAS, right? Good insight cues the buyer cues the buyer to engage with you, right? And it's really four things. It's got to arouse curiosity, right? And the reason why is that your brain has an area in the brain called the thalamus. The thalamus is there as basically as a filtering mechanism, right? And there's so many senses that your body can actually bring in and accumulate. I mean, your skin and the receptors in your skin have the ability to sense a zero point 0.5 degrees Celsius difference in change in temperature. Sorry,
Hmm.
right? But that's not really necessary for your survival. So that's a waste of energy, right? There's a
Yeah.
threshold, right? If it suddenly drops by 10 degrees Celsius, then your brain thinks, well, hang on a second, something's going on here, right? There's a threshold, there's a gated process there. But curiosity is a massive factor because your brain, the reward centers of your brain, for example, when you ingest interesting information, when you acquire interesting information, is exactly the same reward pathway for when you eat sugar. right?
Hmm.
But that reward pathway is really important. So when you think about interesting information, that makes sense because your brain looks at interesting information and says that could be used for our survival. So I'm going to reward for that. So curiosity is a very big part of that. Uniqueness is a very important part as well, right? And it doesn't have to be unique data. It just got to be a unique perspective. So if I was to give you, I mean, just this conversation on neuroscience is a unique perspective that has got you
Hmm.
to actually want to ask more questions. So uniqueness is very important. Emotional arousal, right? So like I said, emotion is a very important part of how we identify things and make decisions about things. It's often touted as the primitive part of the brain, but actually it's very sophisticated for what it is. And then surprising. It's got to be something that's surprising. So
Hmm.
an insight that you, when you can start a sales conversation using those four elements in that framework as part of the basis for your leading with insights, you're gonna not only capture the buyer's attention, but capture their interest and elicit more of a deeper engagement with them. So it's not just about, hey, I've read this about you and your company. Buyers nowadays, their thalamus is like, well, that's known. I don't care about what you already
Yeah.
know. I already know that. Teach me something that I don't either understand, don't see, or have underappreciated in terms of value.
And this
That
is
is
something
going to
that
get
we
my
ask
attention.
every single guest that gets asked this question, and I'm thinking about the greatest way to phrase it to benefit our listeners here. So,
Mm,
given that you've spoken with hundreds and hundreds of buyers as part of your own research, you mentioned that
mm,
really heavily based on what you do, not just I'm feeling this because I've talked to a couple of people. No, you actually have the data to back it up. So I'd love to get your answer to the question: where do you see these salespeople, these buyers, relying on hope more than they should, in that they're just hoping that what they are bringing to the table is going to elicit interest in that prospect, rather than using this Q's acronym, using this process that you have to make sure that you're leveraging every part of the brain that you possibly can to get that buyer to want to know more. So where do you see salespeople relying on hope a little more than they should in that area?
yeah, the instinctive answer I have for you is, firstly, that they don't do their homework.
Okay.
Right? I mean, they just hope that they're going to be able to use the same old approach and ask great questions at the very beginning, hoping that that's going to get the person's attention. I mean,
Mm,
that is just in our day and age where there's radical transparency of information out there. I mean, that's quite, in my opinion, quite frankly, pathetic. Right? I mean, you,
mm,
you should not. There is no excuse for entering a sales conversation without doing some form of intelligence gathering. Right? I mean, you came from a military background. You would never enter into a situation without intelligence. I mean, that's just ridiculous, right? Why
right.
should that be the same in sales, right?
And you
Um,
mentioned driving the initial conversation as being probably one of the
mm,
more critical areas to that. So I think that's what I want to build a sales system with you around, because
yeah,
you and I could talk all day about every aspect of the sales cycle and how neuroscience could be applied. So I want to give
yeah.
the listeners here one really meaty system that they can use. And so when we talk about building systems here, we're ripping hope out of people's sales strategies, just like neuroscience can do for the sales process. So if we're talking about using hope to drive that initial conversation,
Mm,
excuse me, removing hope and using neuroscience, then we're using this acronym TRIM to actually trigger this sales system. And so you mentioned it needs to happen before the initial conversation. That with the transparency of information today, it's almost negligence if you do not do this research and then phrase it in such a way so that you show up to the table prepared to elicit curiosity and uniqueness and emotion and surprise folks when you're in that conversation. So when should I trigger this system? Should it be before I even begin prospecting, as I'm identifying my prospects, or I've identified somebody, know enough about them to know that they could make a good client? Now I'm ready to
yeah,
pick up the phone, but I know I got to do this system that Moeed recommend first. Where does this system trigger in the sales cycle?
yeah. It's a good question. So, and it depends on the definition of trigger. Do you trigger yourself or do you trigger the buyer? Right?
Yourself,
So
as the salesperson. This is the
yourself,
part the
right?
salesperson can own. Yeah.
Yeah. So it starts before you send the email or pick up the call, right?
Okay.
The trigger is um, what do I need to know about this buyer that I'm about to engage with? And usually there are four levels, right? So the first level is the industry,
Hmm.
right? Because one of the surprising elements I found from my interviews was buyers didn't buyers did valued people that understood their industry more so than they understood their business, which
Hmm.
was surprising to me. And the reason why is because everything that they're doing in their business is within the context of that industry.
Sure.
And actually, it's what's going on in the industry that will tell them whether there are any curveballs or blind spots that they're potentially unaware of. So if you think about Porter's 5 forces, that's a very big part of it. So knowledge of industry. The second one is knowledge of the company, right? So the trigger is what do I see is going on in this company in relation to the industry? And things like reading their financial statements, researching about the business and what they're trying to do, researching about the function that you're selling to and how important it is to the business, how much money is being allocated to them, what maturity level that function is in, all those kind of things. Then you talk about the role. It's really important. From asking this of hundreds of salespeople, probably only 5 have ever answered this correctly. And that question is, describe to me the top 3 or 5 MBOs, management by objectives, or KPIs that are most important to your buyer. And when I say management by objectives, I mean on their performance review, when they sit down with their boss, their performance review will have 3 to 5 things that they're expected to deliver that will determine whether they receive their bonus or get promoted, or both.
Right.
If you can't speak about that, how could you possibly understand or align your solution to what benefits them?
And
Right?
obviously, there's lots of places to find that information, or
Of course.
reach into your existing network of clients and say, I was listening to this crazy podcast, and this guy said, I probably should know your KPIs as I'm calling people like you. Would you
Yeah.
mind sharing what those are with me? So a lot of great ways to get that. Love the trigger, because it gives you a lot of stuff to begin to think about going on. But now we're almost melding into the R in this acronym TRIM,
Yeah.
and making this thing repeatable. So
Yes.
now that I know those 3 things, industry, company, and role, what do I need to do? What maybe 3 to 5 steps, real simple system that we can lay out here that's probably going to have a lot underneath it. But what basic 5 things can I do now to use neuroscience to drive that initial conversation?
Yeah. So and then, well, the final one, the 4th one, is person,
Oh, okay.
right? And that's the
All
individual
right.
one. But that's part of it. So first thing, in order to drive initial conversation, this is probably the most surprising whenever I talk about this, is think about your mindset and what you're thinking about before you pick up that call or before you enter that meeting. When you ask a typical salesperson, and Sean, I'd love to get your opinion on this actually. When you ask a salesperson, what usually they're thinking about is, I've got to hit my target. I'm freaking out about my target, or worried about it.
Yeah.
I'm worried about this buyer, because the big scary buyer, really senior person, or I'm not sure if I'm gonna
Right.
be able to resonate with them. Or I've tried speaking to this person before and they just keep fobbing me off. It never goes anywhere. I'm really kind of fed up of speaking to this person. Or a whole myriad of other things. Do you experience the same thing when you
Yeah,
speak
so
to
here's because
salespeople?
we get asked this question a lot, and there's 2 layers to it. So the first layer are all the mission objectives that I need to accomplish in this call, and that way I can take my mind off of how experienced this person I'm meeting with is. They're the CFO of a Fortune 100 company, whatever it is. So I know I need to discover: are you the buyer? Who's the buyer? What challenges are you having? Confirm the information that I'm bringing in there. Discover some new ways I can help. But that's just the first layer. The more important one, the one behind that, is, am I dedicated to helping this person and this organization, regardless of whether we do business or not? Because if that's the case, then I can learn everything I need to in the meeting, or I can try to deliver as much value as I can, whether the sale's made or not. But if I'm not passionate about them and this mission, it doesn't matter how much intel I walk in the room with, it's all going to fall flat.
Right. Okay. So that's interesting. So here's my take on this.
Yep.
The first level, so everything you said, I completely agree with. There is a level there that's a lot deeper, that is always overlooked. And the first thing that I ask people to do is find 1 to 3 things that you admire about this person.
Interesting.
If you think about when we first started our conversation, what did I say at the beginning? I talked about your introduction and the military background. And we talked a bit about that military background. What did I do there? I created a connection, and that connection was through admiration, right? Now, did you feel bad that I'd done that? Or did you feel, actually, do you know what? It kind of drew you, I don't know, you can tell me, but it kind of drew you into the conversation, right? It kind of brought you at a level. I call it just a change in frequency, a frequency just a little bit calmer, right? A little bit more less combative, or less, oh, I'm nervous about what this salesperson is going to say to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the most powerful things you can do at the beginning is to find 1 to 3 things that you admire about this person. And here's the secret sauce. Really mean it. Don't use it as a means to which to create a rapport with this person in a kind of sleazy way, because buyers will sense that it's
Oh, yeah.
disingenuous, right? So you want to make sure that you actually mean it. And what does that do? Well, people love to hear good things about themselves, right? Even those that are not comfortable with, what do you call it? Those that are not comfortable with compliments, they still
Mm-hmm.
like to hear compliments, right? I mean, your brain is wired to accept good information as well and good things about you. It makes you feel good. So start with what makes the buyer feel good. A lot of the times in sales, we're trained to, and this was the misconception around Challenger, which was start by challenging the buyer and telling them what's wrong, right?
Hmm.
Or tell them that the danger is around the corner.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that doesn't get their attention. It does, right? You're wired to look for those things, but it doesn't make you feel good at the beginning of the conversation,
Well, it
right?
activates fear as opposed to connection, for sure.
Absolutely. And I'm not saying that fear or the threat of fear doesn't have its place in a sales conversation. It does, but like I said just then, it has its place. I wouldn't start the conversation like that necessarily,
All right, so
right?
find something to
Um,
connect with the buyer on. What are maybe 1 or 2 other steps that you think would really help out in driving that initial conversation where I could leverage the science of how our brains work to make it a little
yeah,
better for that person and drive more value?
yeah. Talk about something that's totally surprising to them.
Okay.
I'll give you an example that we've used in the past. Um, you know, when selling to Volvo trucks, when this company was selling to Volvo trucks, right? So as an example that was used in Challenger and others, um, what they were selling was the actual sorry, Volvo trucks was selling the trucks, right,
Hmm.
to their clients. And what they used to do was talk about, the quality of the trucks, etc., what that means to logistics, delivery times, all those things. But what they were then trained to do, and what the salespeople then acted on, was they said, um, from Volvo Trucks, I want to talk to you about your employee value proposition today. We're like, hang on a second, what do you mean employee value proposition? Well, looking at your business, what I see is the cost of churn that you have with your truck drivers.
Mm.
And not only the cost of churn, but the cost in terms of finding more truck drivers, hiring them, ramping them up, so the onboarding time, and getting them to full productivity. And when we analyzed all the amount of money involved in that, it came to roughly around this. Right?
Hmm.
Would you agree? Would you agree with that? We may be off the mark a little bit, but would you agree with that? Yeah, we would. That is hugely painful to you as a business. So having deliveries being done on time, in comfort, etc., absolutely, that's important. But there is a peripheral cost of having the wrong types of trucks to your business. And one of the biggest one is this employee value proposition.
Hmm.
We're here to talk to you about how our trucks can not only help with delivery and your logistic times, but to help with your employee value proposition, because most of the time they leave you not because of anything else. Most of the time they leave you because of the quality and comfort of when they're doing their job. And that comes down to the trucks. So why don't we talk about that today? So
Awesome.
very,
Yeah.
very different. Very different, right? I've got a client that specializes in software to FMCG companies, etc., and they're competing with Excel, basically, right? And what we tested out in the beginning was, the average tenure for this type of job title that they sell to is probably less than 2 years, right? It can be about 3 years, but it's usually less than 2 years. We're here to talk to you about why Excel could get you fired,
Hmm.
right? So you're injecting something that's the cues framework there. Curiosity,
Hmm.
it's unique, right? It's arousing emotion, and it's surprising because I wasn't expecting you to talk about that, right? And yet it is connected to me. I'm helping you do what I call see around corners. Well, it's not what I
Hmm.
call, it's seeing around corners. it's helping me see something that I wasn't aware of, like a consequence of something I wasn't aware of. And it's helping me, I may think that it might have only this level of impact of, say, 10%, but actually the impact could be anything more than 50%, but I didn't see that. So when we really value people who are able to help us see further into the future, the further we're able to view danger or view a clearer path in front of us, the more we value that. And that's very deep in our neuroscience and the way that our brain works. So that's another thing that you can use.
All right.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like we've gotten then the trigger, we've got making it repeatable using that cues framework. Now, one thing that we discovered with all systems in the military is that if they remain static, they became less effective by the second almost, because our opponents were constantly iterating and getting better. So we had to update our systems. We don't clear houses in urban environments the same way we did in Vietnam. We had to learn through bitter experience. We had to do it differently. So the I in trim is to make it improvable. So how would you take this framework and make sure that we are assessing it as the market changes, as customer needs change, as the industry that we're selling to changes, to make sure that we're updating it so it is constantly surprising? Because what was surprising in 1985 probably is not going to get as much attention today. So how would you begin to update this system and improve it, and on what timeline?
Yeah, so this one may not be rooted in neuroscience, right? This is more about the principles of business and sales now. When we're entering a period of potential stagflation, it's going to be pretty painful, more equivalent to the 80s and 90s, high interest rates, etc. This is not going to be the same as the 2008 recession. But I did an extensive study of companies in recession periods and what they did in past recessions, and I spoke to business leaders as well as sales leaders who have been through 3 recessions, for example. One of the things that was really important was that, and there were quite a few things, but one of them in relation to what you're saying is, those companies that did well, or those sales teams that did well, they got even closer to their buyers. And what they meant by that was, we took the time to understand how buying behaviors are going to change now that we're in that recession. So there was a clear mandate and a clear priority that this was going to be something that we have to get on top of, because if we don't, we're relying on what you said, hope that it's going to be the same, or hope that if we just do more of the same, it's going to equal better results.
Right.
And that's not going to be the case. Buying behaviors will change in a recession period or in a period of jolt like this. So you've got to get close to your buyers. Now, can everyone do that? No. You've got to find what IBM called intellectually curious people. So you've got to find the salespeople who, and in some case, marketing, but to be frank, salespeople have more touch points with buyers than marketing do in a lot of B2B companies. So, but you can leverage marketing as well. But you've got to find those people that have the right characteristics of curiosity and intellectual curiosity, that they will be tasked and supported with asking the right questions to understand how those buyer behaviors are going to change. And then they're tasked with storing that information or collecting that information and putting it in somewhere, and then sharing that information amongst the rest of the business. So, what did the I stand for again?
Improving,
right.
Making it improvable.
Okay.
Yeah,
make it improvable. Right. So that you can do in shocks, right? In market shocks. But how do you continuously make it improvable? So one thing that we used to do in other companies that I've observed that works very well is, depending on your sales cycle, but on a quarterly basis, what they would do is they would review their understanding of the buyers and their world, in order to then say, well, does our message still seem to resonate, or is something changing here? Are we hearing something different from the buying community? And the salespeople are the best source of that information, because they're at the sharp end of the market.
right.
So they would actually have, as part of their group sessions on a quarterly basis, there is a slot that's mandated in those meetings, which is purely focused on what are we hearing from the buying community at the moment, and does that look different to the document that we have from the past quarter that states all those areas around the buying community. So,
and having seen this done myself, I can also say that if you ask the binary question, are we noticing a lot of change, you might get a no answer out of your team, and that doesn't help you if you're doing this once every quarter. So I've heard it's better said, what are we noticing that's changing? And that way, at least something is elicited that you can then build into your marketing, your outreach, all that stuff. So I want to make sure we have time for this last piece, because I know as a
Mm,
scientist, you're going to love it. The M in trim is measuring this, because I
mm,
need to make sure that if I'm investing the time in understanding everything from industry to company to role to individual, and I'm using this cues framework, takes a little bit of time and definitely some mental energy to run a new, neural pathway in my brain, and all the scripts that I have and all the marketing templates and everything else. This thing has to pay off. So what am I
mm.
measuring to make sure that the investment in this system is something that I want to keep continuing to make? Because otherwise, I'll just go back to the way I was doing it, hoping that I have the most brilliant question this buyer has ever heard. So how do you measure something like this?
Yeah, I mean there are a few levels to that measure, maybe three main ones. So the first measure of this would be the usual metrics, which are average order value, sales velocity,
Hmm.
new brands, retention levels, etc. Things like that. So we would look at that first, because ultimately it's got to improve those things, otherwise there's no value.
Right.
The next level below that would be in terms of the engagement level, right? So the interim velocity elements. So, for example, you'll probably look at velocity of a deal, which is to say, okay, from beginning to end, how fast is it going? But what you're
Hmm.
then going to look at are things like between each stage of the sales process, what is the conversion rate like? What is the
Yeah.
velocity of how those deals transition from this stage to the next stage? So you're
Hmm.
starting to dig a little bit more into the kind of engagement by engagement level of what's going on, right? You will obviously look at marketing as well in terms of things like cost of customer acquisition. You'd be looking at number of MQLs that become SQLs, which is very important. So you'd look at those things as well, but you're looking at in moment to moment elements of the sales or marketing activity that will then tell you, well, is this actually helping me have better conversations, better conversion rates, etc. But then there's a lower below that, which is around the quality of the conversation.
Hmm.
And what I encourage people is to say, there are elements of what you need to know and understand in order for you to know whether this is a good quality deal that's therefore going to advance. So how about we measure for each of those deals how much of that information we know? And this is where you start to talk about the quality of the conversation. So how much is that buyer sharing with me, right? In
Hmm.
terms of what's going on in their world. How much information are they giving me in terms of this stakeholder kind of environment? How much are they supporting me, right? So there's a level of what I call buyer states, right? So there are three categories: advocate, passive, and detractor, but there are 11 states in total within that. How many of my buyers become advocates,
Hmm.
right? Because if I'm speaking to enough buyers that remain passive and therefore don't translate into deals, well, when I categorize that, does that tell me that there's a problem in my conversation? Why am I not able to convince them or convert them, right? And sometimes it'll be according to timing and things like that. So there are kind of three main levels of that measure. There's the strategic almost measurement, which is how we're progressing on all those metrics. There is the operational, which is in the moment kind of metrics that you measure. And then there is the almost tactical, but I call it the kind of quality metrics, which is
Hmm.
what is the quality of the conversations that I'm having, and what is the quality of the relationship that I'm having with those buyers as well. Because if that's not helping me have better quality engagement and relationship, then it's not really going to translate to all those other areas as well. So
It's definitely going to affect
at a high level.
responsiveness, and you're going to need to get back in touch with that prospect in order to advance the deal. So if they never pick up the phone, one conversation is probably not going to do it. But I understand the deeper the relationship, the more you can connect with them, surprise them, offer them value, the more they're going to want to develop that relationship with you. So this has been really a unique conversation. We don't get to talk about neuroscience a lot on this show, so I appreciate
No,
you coming on with us. Now we've
not
got
at
an
all.
entire sales system, the trigger, making it repeatable, improvable, and how to measure it at different levels. A lot of value packed in today. So people are going to want to know how to get more of Moeed in their lives, especially with your background, the research you've done. Where do they find you, and where do they need to go to learn more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Sean. And yeah, I mean, the first one is LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. We have a big community there. Sales is a force for good, that I'm a part of. So /Moeed Amin. You can also check out my podcast and YouTube channel. So the YouTube channel is Proverbial Door. We have a bunch of videos around teaching you on not just sales, but things like financial acumen. So we actually analyze the financial statements of companies that our viewers request us to do so because they're probably trying to sell to them. And then we have a podcast called Persuasion Lab podcast, which you can access all that information. If you want to get in contact with me directly, it's very simply inquiries@proverbialdoor.com. And my team and I respond to everything that comes through.
That is amazing, Moeed. Well, thank you so much for giving us access to more resources where we could find out more about the magic, if you will, of neuroscience, walking through the proverbial door. Love it, man. Love the name of the company and definitely the ability to apply this very systematic process, which is science, into the field of sales. There's not enough of it. Obviously, I love it. And I'm glad to be able to meet somebody that's also got their mind buried deep into this world. So for us here at Bulletproof Selling, make sure you're following us on LinkedIn. All of these YouTube conversations are definitely archived on our YouTube channel. So check them out. We've got dozens and dozens of them with people just like Moeed, all for free, all to help you with that pipeline velocity. And of course, the podcast here on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere the podcast can be found. And of course, for more sales systems, just like the one that you heard to help you replace hope with certainty, make sure you're checking out bulletproof-selling.com, where they are updated each and every day of the week. Well, Sean Rhodes here. It's been a pleasure serving the sales community alongside you, Moeed. Let's get out there and make selling bulletproof.